I thought I'd do a different sort of video for this one because I saw this comment under my Catabasis video. This person had mentioned about this article that was written in 2022 right after Babel came out, and it's titled Babel by R.F. Kuang, a successful thematic response to the secret history by Megan Peterson. And if anyone is interested, you can go read the article. But I actually got this idea while reading the article, is that how people oftentimes misinterpret the secret history, because if there's any book that's been like popularly misinterpreted or have been aestheticized for its aesthetics rather than its actual thematic bits in the book, it's the secret history. And I thought I'd do this video talking, or more accurately debunking, a lot of the misconceptions around the secret history. I haven't actually finished Babel. I DNF'd it the first time I read it because it was so boring. I have to pick it up again to do my video on Babel review to see if it actually does a thematic response to the secret history, which I mean I doubt it is, but you know, I can be proven wrong. So when I do that video, I will update you of my thoughts of what I think about Babel and its thematic response to the secret history then. But for this video, I thought I'd go through the article, or more accurately most of the misconception circling the secret history, and then thought I'd explain a few things about what the secret history is really talking about, why it doesn't make sense for Rebecca to have said that it is supposed to be a thematic response to the secret history, and you know, just yapping about the secret history because it is one of my favorite books of all time. It is such an incredible piece of work, really. Like, imagine putting 10 years of your life to write one book. I really have no words to say because people are still hung up about it. You know, it came out in 1997. We're in 2025. It's been nearly 28 years and people still love it, and it's still something that holds people's attention, something that grabs them at their heart like it did for me. I read this like 5 times, and each time I read it, I feel as if I've gotten something new out of it, or there's something I hadn't realized before that when I read it the first time, all the little tidbits and the fact that, you know, it's so subtle you don't realize it the first time, and it's only on like the 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever reread is when you start to pick up the threads that you really see what Donna Tartt is doing, what a masterpiece in 10 years of making can actually look like, how you put so much of yourself, of your thoughts, of your ideas, of everything to write this one book for 10 years. Imagine just spending 10 years of your life. That's a very long time on just writing one book. And can you imagine the kind of absurdity or passion you've got to have written a kind of book? You know, it's nearly unimaginable. Like, if Rebecca had written Babel for 10 years and then she called it a thematic response to the secret history, I would give her props. I'm like, yes, you did put in the time, you did put in the work to realize this book to the best possible version that it could be, rather than just writing Babel in 1.5 years, 2 years, and then calling it a thematic response to the secret history. I'm like, girl, did you even spend more time with this book to even realize the kind of absurdity you have to put into the book for it to become a masterpiece than just, you know, writing a story on publisher's deadline and just saying that it's a thematic response to the secret history? Like, that's not how it works. And so we will go into this talking about the secret history, what my thoughts on it. It's not necessarily a book review. I'm just talking about what I love about it, and, you know, debunking the misconception and giving you a deeper look into what seemingly might just be a story about a bunch of college students who just commit murder. So I should probably give you a bit of a summary about what the secret history is. If you've read it, then you know. For those who have not read the secret history is a dark academia, which in all time it is the only book to properly utilize the term of dark academia. Like, any other books I see these days are called dark academia. They're not. They're just put there to fit in the vibes of the book. They're not dark academia. If there's any other dark academia book, is Frankenstein. That's a dark academia book. And that's also the problem I have, that people keep misinterpreting the term dark academia. They just think that just because the setting of the novel is in a university or a higher educational institute, it's dark academia. Just because the characters wear dark clothes in a academic setting, it's dark academia. Just because there's some sort of form of mystery concerning an educational institute, it's become dark academia, which is that's not what dark academia is. As far as I realize dark academia to be, dark academia concerns the education of the principal character. It concerns the dark descent of the character's obsession or their pursuit of education to a dark descent. For a book to be considered to be dark academia, the principal education or the subject matter at hand has to be the core part of the story. It has to be the principal theme that revolves around the character's attitude towards it, the character's response towards it, and the character's eventual consequence in pursuing it to this other extreme end. And the reason I say that Frankenstein is a dark academia book, because the whole point of Victor Frankenstein is his obsession and madness in reanimating a corpse. He wants to play God, and his obsession with it is when he is studying medicine in university, and he becomes so obsessed with trying to reanimate the corpse to create a human, to play God essentially. That is what leads to the birth of the monster Frankenstein. And it's so funny that in popular culture now we associate Frankenstein with the monster, but the monster is not called Frankenstein. The scientist, the guy who reanimates the corpse, is called the Victor Frankenstein. The monster essentially is Frankenstein's monster, but somehow we've colloquially deemed the monster is also called as Frankenstein, which is really ironic in the sense that Victor does go on to basically abhor the creature that he's created, that he absolutely feels that it is an abomination and he tries to kill it, which does not end well. So what I'm saying here is that dark academia, in principle, has to concern the education, the primary subject the character is pursuing, and the extreme ends the person goes in pursuing this subject matter or the education that concerns them. That's what dark academia is. It is this dark pursuit of academia. That's what it means. It's not about the aesthetics. It's not about the vibes of the autumn swirling mist or whatever it is. And it's so funny that this is the book that gave birth to its genre. This is the book that literally opened the entire aesthetic to the dark academia vibe. And it's so funny that the whole point and thematic bit of this book is warning you about what happens when you aestheticize things. Like, Richard's whole point in the story is homeboy refuses to see the truth for what it is. He has to view things in a rose-colored glasses. He tells us his fatal flaw is the morbid longing for the picturesque that literally translates to aestheticizing things in regards to what they are rather than seeing the truth for what it is. That is the whole point Donatas makes in the story, that homeboy refuses to see the truth what it is, and that's what got him into the horrible part of killing his friend. That is literally what happens. And yet people go on about how the dark academia vibes are immaculate, how they literally aestheticize this vibe rather than actually understand what it actually is, which is so funny. And you cannot write this sort of irony. This thing just writes itself, and it's amazing. And okay, so Secret History is a dark academia novel concerning these 5 college students who murder one of their friends and what happens as a consequences to it. And the story starts off with Richard going off to this college in Vermont called Hampden College, and while he's there, he sort of sees these other 5 students. They are not in any of the other regular classes. They are being exclusively taught by this very elusive, strange professor called Julian Morrow, and they are learning classics. And Julian is very specific about the students he admits into his class. At first, Richard wants to join them because he sees those 5 students and he's like, I dig their vibe, I want to be part of it. And that's Richard's whole problem. Homeboy refuses to face truth for what it is, to really see the horrors of the beauty that makes it look like he's viewing them through rose-tinted glasses. And this is also a theme Donna Tartt brings up in the novel, and I'll get to it later on in the thematic bit. And so he sees this group of students and he really digs their vibe, and he's like, I need to join them. And he learns that, they're part of the classics class. So he tries his best to get in there. He gets rejected at first, and then on the second time, Julian accepts him, and so he becomes part of the class, not essentially the friend group, but just part of the class. And then as the story progresses, he gets to learn the characters more and more, and he becomes embroiled in the weird things that they start to do. Initially, Richard is not privy to a lot of their plans. He's just joined this class. Nobody actually knows who he is or what he is. And we also cannot take Richard's words for anything. Like, homeboy lies out of his teeth. Like, it's a natural thing to do. Like, he literally says that the one skill or super skill that he has is that he has the ability to lie on his feet. Like, he just comes up with the most outrageous lie when he's put on the spot. And he literally, throughout the entire novel, he has been lying to his other friends, and they never really learn the truth. And so you really can't take his word for whatever he's saying through the secret history either, because he is an unreliable narrator, and he's giving it all from his perspective, which is already untrustworthy in the first place. We don't really know what happens. We're all taking it into account from what Richard says, so how much of it can we really trust? So it's a very wonderful book to read, because you don't really know what is the truth, what really happened, and if we can really trust Richard at all. So initially he doesn't get involved in whatever the others in the class are privy to until he learns that they had actually killed a person. He then becomes part of this other assassination, essentially, of them trying to kill their other friend, who is quite properly is on the verge of revealing the truth of them killing this farmer. And so they all band together and kill him before the truth get revealed. And then that is when Richard becomes ineffably part of the group, and he, even if he wants to leave, he can't leave anymore. And that's really how the story starts, is that Richard says from the very beginning, at any other time of his life, he might have had any number of stories to tell, but after what he had witnessed and what had happened, he says that this is the only story I'll ever be able to tell, and this is the story of the secret history. And the entire secret within that group, the secret history, is them killing Bunny, essentially. They all get away with murder, but not without its consequences. And so that is essentially what the novel is about. And if anyone wants to pick it up, please do, I beg you, go to it. And so coming back to the article that's written, so here's a line I wanted to talk about. Quote, "In fact, both books are concerned with whether morality is changeable from decade to decade or society to society, and specifically, it is something the respective main characters wrestle with, though they find themselves on different sides of the argument once they reach the conclusion." So I wouldn't say morality is a big theme in the secret history. Like, it is there as a part, but I think morality in its entirety is not what Donna Tartt is talking about. She is talking about people's inability to empathize, especially because she's critiquing this elitism of higher institution, and she shows this specifically in regards to Julian's class. And this is something even I did not notice the first time I read it, was that the reason why Julian only has these 5 students in his class is because they are essentially rich. They are like a super rich, like top wealth bracket kind of rich. They do not even need to work after getting a degree kind of rich. And that's the funny thing that I didn't realize it the first time. I just thought that, Julian has this group of students in his class because they're like, really smart. Because once Richard joins the classic class, he tells us that, Henry is like the smartest person in that class, and literally everyone else, including Richard, is smart, and except for Bunny. Bunny is, I won't say dumb, but he's not as intellectually inclined as the rest. And it's so ironic that Richard tells us that Bunny is the one who's studied Greek the longest, because he's probably dyslexic. We don't really get that outright when Richard says that, but we get the impression that he was dyslexic, and so his parents actually sent him to therapy, and a therapist recommended him learn to read and write in Greek so that it might help him understand, the normal alphabets better. And so for me, that first impression was, I thought that, Julian has these people in class because he's very specific about people who he wants to teach, and they have to be like really, really smart and really passionate about Greek. And it's only on my second, third read that I realized, oh, my man is not about the intellect, my man is about the money. Also, when Richard first goes to meet his tutor, George Lafaux, he expresses this idea that he wants to take the Greek class because he saw that, this group of students are studying classic, and he's taken Greek for, I think, 3 years. And so he's like, I want to be part of it. And George, he warns him that first time, not to get embroiled in that class, not to get involved with Julian. And he says specifically that if Julian finds out that you are on the college assistant, as in financial aid, he might think differently otherwise. I didn't pick it up the first time until I realized that Julian actually rejects Richard the first time he asked to join the class, because he didn't know who Richard was or if he's actually rich or anything. And it is only after Richard's interaction with the group where he helps them with one of their translations. And then Camilla is the one in class with Julian at the time, and she said, oh, you're the one I heard outside of Julian's class the other day. And then Richard reveals, yeah, I was trying to, ask him to take me in as a student as well. And it's so funny that it is Bunny that's the one who actually tells him, try talking to Julian another time and see what he says. And we get this idea that, Bunny might have talked to Julian into accepting Richard into the class. No, at this point, nobody actually knows Richard's financial background yet. And so Bunny talking to Julian to allow Richard into their class is such a divine irony in its entirety. And the fact that Julian took Bunny's word at face value, because he realizes that these are rich kids, they're not going to be spending time or interacting with middle class people or even poor people. Like, if anyone they're going to be meddling with, it's going to be the rich people. So the fact that Bunny brings up Richard's name and suddenly Julian's like, oh shit, maybe homeboy is rich, maybe I should give him a chance, that's really why he actually allows Richard in the second time to come and sing, because he assumes that he is rich, and that's why he gives him any time of the day. And when Richard goes to see him and they have this conversation and they talk, and all this while Julian is sort of trying to assess him, really try and see if homeboy is lying about anything. Is he really rich for Bunny to have said, take him into the class? But we all know Richard's incredible talent is lying on his feet, so homeboy has just been lying through his teeth with Julian, and Julian buys it, and eventually so does the other students, except for Bunny. Bunny has this really strange capacity to sort of, sniff out bullshit, essentially. He kind of knows that Richard is kind of bullshitting his way, but Richard is, his skill is lying on his feet. So Bunny actually is the one who senses it compared to the other students in the class. And so it's really funny how, because of Bunny, that all of this happened. And it's also because of Bunny inviting Richard that he gets embroiled in all of this. And then when they kill him is because of that as well. Like, it all leads up to that. And so it's essentially just divine irony in the first place. And so actually coming back to morality, and that's the thing, morality is not so much as the greater theme here. I would say the bigger theme in The Secret History concerns more the picturesque, really, the idea that we aestheticize things to view them through these rose-tinted glasses, or we aestheticize them for their beauty rather than really see truth for what it is. And this is essentially what the truth is, and what Richard as a character tells us, that he refuses to see the truth for what it is. He refuses to actually see the very glaring red flags from the very beginning, and that's really what got him into the kind of trouble that he does. And the fact that Donatot is critiquing the point of this elitism, that just because you see these rich people, you think they've got everything, you think they are essentially God in their own rights, that they are untouchable. And then when Richard finally throws off those rose-tinted glasses and he actually sees the other students in class for what they really are, he thinks that, oh my god, how did I ever think that these people were cool, or that they were good people, which essentially they are not. And that's why Donatot writes these characters not as people you should aspire to be. She's talking about at the horrors of not looking at truth for what it is. She's telling these are all horrible people, and she's literally been describing them as these horrible people from the very beginning. But because we're reading it from Richard's perspective, we see them too through these rose-tinted glasses. We see them all as this incredible group of people, so intellectual, so incredibly smart, and they're so immaculate in their taste, and they're rich and everything. We see them through these picturesque views rather than actually getting to know them as person of who they are, what they actually are, the kind of things they think about. And morality is the last thing on their mind. And it's a wonderful line that Francis says in the book when Richard discovers that they've killed this farmer. He says, this guy, he's not a Voltaire, but it's still a shame and I feel bad about it, which is such a shocking thing to say essentially after you've killed someone, as in they don't even view this farmer as a person who is worthy of a life. They actually see him lesser than that, because they're like, oh no, he's a farmer, he's essentially a nobody, he's not even smart. Like, yeah, sure, we feel bad about it, but it's whatever. It's not that they have this moral compass that they've actually killed the person, committed murder, they've taken a life, and the horrible implications all that has on them. No, that doesn't concern them. In Henry's word is he likes to think of it as a redistribution of matter. So essentially they don't really care that they've killed someone. They feel bad about it, it's a horrible thing to happen, but they're not going to lose sleep over it. Like, they essentially don't until they kill Bunny, and then they start to spiral, except for Henry. But Henry is essentially a sociopath, so we can't really take him into account with the other students. So I would say that it doesn't really concern morality. The book is criticizing how the wealthy does not regard people lower in status to them as someone who almost deserve a life as they do, or even people who are so intellectual because they have this wealth too, that they are able to be this intellectual. It's essentially classism. She's critiquing the classism, how the view that these people, even Bunny gets this treatment, that almost like literally all of them except for Richard, they know that Bunny's family is essentially bankrupt, and yet Bunny is the kind of person who sort of like clings on to rich friends and sort of eats off them, essentially. Like, he's a parasite really. And so they also view him in a different lens, as someone who is not equal to them in terms of wealth. They see him as somehow lesser. So that's why when the time came for them to essentially kill him, they don't really feel that bad about it. Yeah, they feel bad because their friend, but what they sort of rationalize themselves of it, they don't really talk about morality at all. They sort of just rationalize it that they're doing it for their own good, that they don't want to end up in jail. And besides, Bunny's family is bankrupt and he's not rich, so it wouldn't really matter. It's not that they're about to murder someone, and not even just someone, it's their friend. They don't even think about that. They have to preserve themselves from going to jail, because they can't end up in jail because they're rich and smart. It's essentially what they think in the novel, what Richard tells, they sort of rationalize to themselves before they commit the murder, or when they commit the murder, is that it's not so much if it's right or wrong to kill someone, what are the morality of it, or the implications of taking a life. They don't really talk about the morality of that territory. They are more concerned of their self-preservation, and it comes down to essentially the elitism and the classism that they all grew up in, that they believe that they are far more important to society, or a far more intellectual mind that is required for society, rather than someone like the farmer or Bunny. It's not the moral implication that they've murdered someone or they've taken someone's life and that's a horrible thing to have happened. No, they think that it's basically a redistribution of matter. Is that it doesn't matter if they die, they're not contributing anything to society, so that it doesn't matter. People will be more concerned or more devastated had someone like a scientist or a poet or someone with great value to society had died, then yeah, sure, but not this trivial people like the poor. So that's the thing. It's not so much about morality, but it's more of the elitism and the classism and the kind of culture that surrounds it, the kind of people who are brought up in this various class, and how they think of people as essentially being lesser than them. And that includes Julian as well, because he's the one who kind of molds them into his image, essentially. Because other than Richard, the five of them have been with him for a considerably longer time. So they, especially Henry, whatever they think, whatever they rationalize, whatever thoughts they have, whatever kind of mindset they sort of cultivate, it comes from Julian as well. And Julian is a extremely extreme elite person. Like, my man only rubs shoulder with the super rich, with celebrities, with people incredibly well known. Like, he will not give you a time of the day. He view things like you're even 1% below his wealth bracket. Like, Julian, he's such a horrible character, but he's such a horrible character that he's interesting to read. He's interesting to dissect and understand where he's coming from. Why is he so perpetually obsessed with rich kids, especially? Why does he have this need to mold them into his image? Because that's what he essentially does. He's just propagating his dogmas upon them. And the whole class, they literally do not have any other teacher. And Julian's response to this was that, Alexander the Great only had one student, so did Aristotle, and they have gone on to become great philosophers. And that's essentially his rationality for just teaching all of them all the time. Like, they only spend time with Julian. They do not go to any other classes. They do not meet any other lecturers. They are essentially isolated from the rest of the school. And that, it really visually shows you the kind of thing that classism actually brings in, and elitism, that, these people are so far isolated from the common people, from the middle class, from essentially the majority of society, that they are essentially in their own world. And we see this again and again in rich people, where their awareness for what is happening in the world is very far removed from how normal people actually live and experience. They do not experience the same hardships. They do not experience the economic recessions or hardships or any of the turmoil that, people in working class or middle class, or even those who are just one line away from poverty, experience. Like, they are so removed from the essentiality of society that they don't even know what it means to be integrated into society, because they live in their own castle in the cloud. Like, quite literally, they don't know anything that's happening outside of it. And this really, visually brings into the idea why the students do the things that they do, and why that also feeds into their own psyche, that their own, to inform them of what they then essentially end up doing. And this also circles back to the point of the elitism. The moment Richard steps into Hampden College, at first he's like, he's just taking it all in. But then the moment he sees those 5 classic students, and he's like, I want to be part of them. And he has this whole shift of perspective. And the moment the desire to join them comes in, he starts to see that he is essentially better than everyone, even before he has joined. And this is very prominent in his interaction with this other character called Judy Poovey. And Judy is the real MVP of the series, I'd say. She is the realest girl in that series. She clocks the red flags for what they are. She literally wants Richard. And does homeboy ever listen? No. And so the moment Richard has this desire to join the classics class, and then when he does, he adopts this attitude, he really is better than everyone else in the college. Like, he's studying under Julian, he's with his other classic students, they're all rich, and like, homeboy is literally floating on a lie there. He literally has lied about everything about himself. Nobody knows the truth. And he's adopted this attitude of he's better than everyone because he's studying classics and because he's hanging around with this really rich people. We see that throughout the entire thing. And then it is only after they've murdered Bunny and he comes to really see the severity of his action, of what he's done, what the others have done, and he finds that his guilt, the inner monologue of his guilt, is turned up very loud. He is consumed by the guilt that he's killed someone, and he compares that to Henry, who just seems like homeboy just took like a really good nap and he's like feeling the best he's ever been, and he's like, oh my god, he's an actual psychopath. And so that's when he starts to realize that, maybe he's misjudged them. He's done that from the very beginning, but that's the moment he actually realizes, oh shit, this is what I've done. Judy is always there to help Richard, and does he ever thank her? Is he ever grateful? No, he's a piece of shit, really. And so Judy comes in, she sees that, oh no, he looks really horrible, maybe I can help, and she invites him to this party, and he goes to the party, and that's when this realization hits Richard, how he, even though he's not rich, he's not an elite person, he's literally from lower middle class family background from Plano, he has nothing in common with the other classics students except that they study classics. And he comes to realize that he had purposefully isolated himself in joining Julian's class. He's literally cut himself off from the rest of the university, from the rest of the student group, from Judy and her friends, and everybody who sort of goes partying every other weekend or something. He literally says that, he got too attached to this idea of his life wanting to be this picturesque that he's always imagined to be, that he didn't realize that actual life was happening at college campus, and he was just too blind to see it because he was viewing the classics class through the rose tinted glasses, that he wanted to be so a part of it that he didn't realize that he was already part of the life that he had imagined he wanted to have the moment he had applied to come to Hamden. And that's literally the irony. The future he had imagined, that he had aspired to have, was already there the moment he stepped into Hamden College. It's just he's not satisfied with it. He never was, and he wanted to feel special. He wanted something extra. He wanted to be the main character. And so he goes knocking on to Trouble's door, wanting to join into Julian's class, even after Judy has warned him to say, those people are freaks, they worship the Satan. And it's so ironic. I mean, if you knew the mythical context of what she's saying, she's not really saying anything wrong. They really were. And that his tutor George says that Julian is trouble, do not get involved, you're gonna regret it, and if anything happens, we can't help you. Because essentially when Richard goes to take Julian's class, he tells him to drop every other class and every other tutor except for, I think, maybe French or something. He says you should take one modern language so it comes up to your credit or something. And so people have been telling him from the get-go, from the very beginning, do not get involved. And homeboy is like, I'm still gonna get involved because they're very shiny and I like shiny things. So that's the other line in the article that says, there is a paradox in the reality that Babel, a fantasy book, is set in the 1830s and the secret history is in the 1980s. And yet it is the latter that exists in an imaginary world where the West is completely devoid of people of color. The cause of this paradox is quite easy to ascertain, that as Babel was published in 2022, while the secret history hit shelves in 1997, our cultural awareness and standard for diversity were remarkably different in the late 90s, something that is more reflective of the realities of systemic racism and other forms of xenophobia rather than the malleability of morality and equality. In fact, both books are concerned with whether morality is changeable. Okay, so from what I've gathered, or at least from the reviews I've talked about, the point of contingency that Rebecca is making in Babel is that the secret history is too white. There's no diverse character. Her book has diverse character. And I'm like, is that all? Because the secret history is a dark academia book that is essentially a parody of a Greek tragedy. And Donna Tartt says this. She says one of the play that inspired the secret history is the Bacchae by Euripides. And the Bacchae is this play about the god Dionysus who comes to establish his rights in Thebes. And it does briefly come up in the secret history. But if you actually really read it, you see how much of the Bacchae is actually underlying theme of the book, how the book in itself is essentially a parody of a Greek tragedy, and that Donna Tartt is writing a tragedy, not a Greek tragedy, but a tragedy nonetheless, because this is a story about a group of people who kill their friend and the consequences that they have to live with. And if you have read any Greek tragedy at all, that's what it's essentially all about. It's about what happens in consequence to a character's action. You have Antigone, you have the Bacchae, you have the Oresteia. Like literally the whole point of the Oresteia is the murder that Orestes commits and the consequences that he has to face, like quite literally by the Furies who hunt him down to punish him for committing the murder that he does. And she is writing this in the forms of a Greek tragedy. When you read the secret history in this line, you can see how clearly it does read as a Greek tragedy, that once the murder is done, literally all the characters, maybe except for Henry, but he does feel some things, they all start to spiral. And actually, coming back to the Oresteia and Furies, one of their lessons early on when they're learning about the tragedians and all the tragic plays, they particularly discuss the one with the Oresteia. And one of the things that Julian says about the Furies who hunt Orestes are sort of like a metaphor for the inner turmoil and the guilt that one person experiences, because the Furies hunt Orestes once he had murdered his mother for the crime of murdering his father. So he's essentially avenging his father, but he's also committing murder in the same time. It's the Furies are somehow the sort of metaphor for the inner guilt, for the inner turmoil that happens. And he explains it that, that is why Orestes feels that he's being hunted, he's committed a murder, that we cannot escape ourselves, that we cannot sort of, get away from being stuck in our own heads, in our own self. And he particularly mentions that the Furies, they not only are they a metaphor for the inner turmoil and guilt that a person feels, but they also sort of amplify that inner dialogue, that guilt that surrounds us. And I'm talking about this in particular because there was a YouTuber I had watched who was ranking dark academia books that she was reading, and then she got to the secret history and she read the first half. She's like, okay, it's interesting so far, and then she said the second half felt like a Gossip Girl. And in comparison, she read Babel and she's like, oh my god, Babel is woke. I love it. I'm exaggerating and summarizing what she says, but the underlying story was that she felt like the secret history felt more like it was fine for the first half, and then like it turned into Gossip Girl for the second half, and then Babel was a lot better because it brought out a lot of stuff, I guess, for her to say, it's more woke than the secret history. And I guess if you read it on the surface level, it might feel like that. But even when I read it for the first time, I never felt that the second half of the story felt like Gossip Girl at all. I mean, mind you, I never watched Gossip Girl before, so like I can't relate. But even reading that second half, I've always felt that the characters are starting to spiral. Like, yeah, first they committed the murder of the farmer, and he's essentially someone they don't know. He's practically a stranger to them, so they don't feel anything. They feel bad that they killed him, but like, yeah, that's it. But it's not as bad when they murder Bunny, and Bunny was their friend, despite all the horrible things that he's done in the story. And that's the thing, Donata writes, or more accurately, we see from Richard's perspective that because Bunny was this horrible person, because Bunny was somehow rude to all of them, he was misogynistic, he was homophobic, he was a lot of these horrible things, we also come in terms to agree with Richard that, maybe Bunny, did deserve to get killed because he was so unlikable. And there's a bias towards that where, we do come to agree with Richard because of Bunny's behavior, when in reality that shouldn't have been the case, because regardless of who Bunny is as a person, that shouldn't have been the point of you wanting to kill him. Like, yeah, he can be a horrible person, but that doesn't excuse your reason for killing him. Like, at first he was mad that he was not part of the Bacchanalia, because he was also part of the planning with all of them to perform the Bacchanalia, but Bunny is a nuisance essentially, and he was not taking it seriously, and so the others didn't tell him when they were performing it, and they performed it themselves. Henry, Charles, Camilla, and Francis. And then when Bunny comes to learn that not only did they perform a Bacchanalia, but they also killed this person, at first he was mad that he did not get the joy, but then somehow the weight of that secret of knowing that these people had killed someone, like, he cannot bear that secret, he cannot bear the guilt of holding it. That's what he sits on the verge of actually exposing the truth, and that's really when the others notice that he's about to expose them all for murder, and so that's why they go and they murder him. And not only did they murder him, they involve Richard as well, so that he can be part of the accessory part of the murder as well. So actually, if you read the story, you would see that Henry essentially had meant for Richard to be their scapegoat in some ways. That's the only reason he involved him, and Richard was stupid enough to get involved because he was so enamored by this group that he wanted to be part of everything that they do. The fact that he thinks that they might have excluded him from doing something feels so hurtful and horrible to him. Like, the moment he's like, oh my god, they're letting me on this incredible secret, he's like so excited about it, and then he finds out it's murder, and he's like, okay, cool, what can I do to help? Like, homeboy is as dumb as they come. The moment he learned that they did commit murder, like, he was already on their target list essentially, or more accurately on Henry's target list, because he knows that they murdered someone, Bunny knows they murdered someone too. So between the both of them, either one has to die or both has to die for the secret to be safe and for the other self-preservation. So what I'm trying to say here is that the fact that this YouTuber had called the second half kind of feels like Gossip Girl. The reason why it does feel like that is because once they've burned money, what Julian had said about the furies and the amplifying of the inner turmoil, the guilt of the inner monologue, that is what essentially is happening here. They've killed Bunny and now they can't bear the consequences that come with it. The guilt is far too overwhelming, and we see them spiral in different ways. Richard cannot sleep anymore. Homeboy is taking pills and alcohol like he is planning on his passive suicide on any day now. Francis has become incredibly anxious. He started having really bad panic attacks. Like, he's never had panic attacks before, and the first time he's had it, he thinks he's having a heart attack. And when Richard brings him to the hospital because they think, there's something wrong, he might be having a heart attack, the doctor just says he has a panic attack, and they both know why this has happened. And Charles literally starts becoming an alcoholic. Like, he cannot be sober anymore. Like, he keeps drinking and drinking to a point that he doesn't see any point to being sober. Like, he's literally drowning in his guilt and sorrow. I mean, Henry feels the best that he's ever been. He's like, oh my god, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. But we also don't get much about Camilla because Richard aestheticizes the fuck out of her, so we don't really know if she has ever felt this inner turmoil or guilt, or maybe she's processing it in a different way. And so we're all getting this from Richard's perspective, so we can only take this from what he says. The way he implies is that Camilla does feel bad about it, but she's more like Henry. Like, it doesn't really matter to her that they had killed Bunny. Like, she's just glad that the secret is safe and no one is going to be exposing them. Essentially, what I'm trying to get here is that Donatan already gives us all of the clues, all of the context, all of the necessary part in the story for us to understand the secret history as a whole novel, as a parody of a Greek tragedy. So that's why I always felt that people who read it on a surface level, or even not even surface level, but people who read it just one time and be done with it, they don't really get most of this underlying theme of a lot of these threads that she's connecting from one to another. And coming back to the Oresteia too, there's also a lesson. Julian is telling them how the Greek, they were very civilized people, but yet they also had a great awareness that the gods exist, that the gods are something that is out of their control, and whenever they do anything in reverence of the god, they have to be completely submitted to them. They surrender to the animal instincts within them, that they let go. And this is very different from how the Romans live. The Romans do not let out their feelings at all. They're very proper, rigid people in their civilized manner. That's why even their gods, the Romans did appropriated most of the Greek gods into the Roman image, and even then they changed them to be more like how they view their civilization to be, which is very stoic, very civilized, that they have to present themselves as this regal people rather than the Greeks, who were very prone to a lot of their hysterics and the otherworldliness. And this is also one of the essential theme in the story. There's so many threads I'm talking about here that you cannot get away once you start seeing it. Is that one of the opening words in the novel before we start the novel is a quote from Nietzsche from The Birth of Tragedy, if I'm not mistaken. The quote follows: 1. A young man cannot possibly know what the Greeks and Romans are, and 2. He does not know whether he's suited for finding out about them. And this actually comes into great play within the story, is that the Greek class, before Richard actually becomes part of the group, they have been planning to hold this bacchanalia when Julian had mentioned it in class. And that's the thing, I have always seen that Julian had nudged them to performing bacchanalia. He gave them all the essential things that requires of them to do the bacchanalia, and he wants to see, what do they get out of it, how are they going to come out of it, what are they going to experience, what are they going to figure out. And it's very funny that they perform a bacchanalia, and yet they refer to, or Henry refers to, the person that they see during bacchanalia is Dionysus, which is oddly strange considering that Dionysus is the Greek term for the god, and the Romans actually called him Bacchus, and that's where the name bacchanalia comes from. It's Bacchus Annalia, Bacchus festival. And so it's funny that they don't call Dionysus as Bacchus in the Roman term, they call him Dionysus in the Greek term, and yet they hold a bacchanalia, and is what is pointing towards what Nietzsche is talking about here in his quote, that a young man cannot possibly know what the Greeks and Romans are, because they even confuse the whole idea, or essentially they do not know the proper term of how to regard the gods in which term between the Greek and Roman. And that's also something Richard mentions to us in the book, how Henry is entirely in his mind a Roman man, and yet he is trying to find a way to believe or find a way to express himself through the Greek. And those are two very different people, just like how Julian had mentioned, the Greeks and Romans are two very, very different people. And Richard then mentioned how Henry, because everything in this book is because of Henry, once he committed that first murder and then the murder of Bunny, he tells Richard, and Richard largely agrees with him, is that it was the first time in a really long time that he had actually felt alive, that he was not stuck in his mind. He did not feel this listless life to uphold himself all this time as Henry. He finally felt alive. This rush, this thrill, this hysterics of what Julian had always described the Greeks to have, this idea that they surrender themselves to a higher power of the gods, that they surrender themselves to the hysterics, to their dancing and their singing and the crying. That's why Greek theatre in those days, they are not just how we view as theatre today. It's not just people saying their lines. Greek theatre was performed in song and dances, and the lines are recited in poetry, because if you read in actual Greek, you would see they're written in poetic meters. I cannot remember which pentameter they talk about, but essentially it's a very specific Greek way of writing poetry, and that's how Greek plays get written. They're written in a sense of poetry, and they are performed with singing and dancing and music. That's how plays really were essentially shown back then. It's not the kind of play that we associate today. It's closer to a musical rather than a Shakespearean play, I would say. And so the whole idea of this Greek and Romans, and the whole idea that these people confused about, it really comes back to what Nietzsche is talking about, how a young man cannot possibly know what Greeks and Romans are, and he does not know whether he's suited to finding out with them. Because Henry, Francis, Camilla, Charles, once they did do this bacchanalia and they really see the consequences of their action, they realize they really are not suited to finding out what it truly takes to perform the rites of Bacchus, essentially. And that's the thing, they do not do it in the name of Bacchus or Bromius, as the Romans would call him. They call him Dionysus, and Dionysus is very, very different to the Roman Bacchus. Dionysus is one of the youngest gods to be established into the Olympians, but he's also the most human god, and so he brings out the most primal, the most human instinct that we have. And Dionysus as a god is very fascinating, and so that's because you have to understand, this was a woman writing a novel in the 80s, predominantly, when a time that is so different from the time that we live now. Even 10 years from where we are today is vastly different to the life that we live now. There's more diversity, yes, there's more diversity, there's more equality for people, and that couldn't be said 10 years ago, and that it certainly couldn't be said in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Those were wildly different times. Racism was rampant. I mean, racism is still rampant now, but there was systemic racism. You cannot essentially assume that someone like Dawn Hazard, a white woman in her 70s, is going to write about people of color, because one, she's not a person of color herself, and two, she's a white person, so of course she's going to gravitate toward writing about white people. And three, even if she does write more diverse characters or people of color, it's not going to essentially reflect what she herself has experienced, or as a white woman. Like, she can only write from her perspective. She can only talk about what she knows. And this was back in the 70s. It's not like the world we live in now, where we have our phones and we can just look things up anytime we want. The internet, it was not even invented back then. How people are not going to write about essentially the kind of things that we read today about diverse characters of different race, genders, and everything. And so what the critique that's happening here, that Rebecca, from what I can infer from her thematic response to The Secret History, essentially, is that she's just talking about there's no diverse character, they're all just white, which I don't see a problem with, because that's really what the story is about. Donata is not talking about systemic racism or the way people of color are being treated in this world, in higher education, or anything. It's about the nonsense that rich white people get up to when they're rich and white, essentially. And it's also that what fuels to the theme of classism and elitism, because these kids are essentially white and privileged, and they come from wealth, and that's why they can afford this privilege of doing whatever they want, and that they can study classics. The part of what I have always inferred, that the reason these kids study classics is not because, okay, maybe except for Henry, it's not that they have this deep love for Greek and Roman studies, or they're like vastly interested in the subject. No, they study classics because they can afford it, because they're rich, essentially. Because you do not see anyone else give interest to wanting to study classics. Even Richard, when he came to Hampden, he was adamant on studying English literature. Like, homeboy was doing medical degree back in his own time in community college, and it was like, I cannot take that shit, and he ran away. And then he came to Hampden, and he was going to study English literature. And the whole reason he even shifted to classics is because he saw these kids. He's like, I want to get in with this group, I want to be a part of them. And that's the whole reason why he went to study classics. And even after that year, that one whole year of stint in the classics, he still transferred back to English literature. So there's no point in the story where anyone ever expressed a deep desire to study classics because they're deeply interested in it. Maybe except for Henry, but Henry is, he's an outlier in this situation, so we cannot take into account anything that Henry does as like a reflection of the vast majority. Talking about different themes in regards to her characters being white, and I'm not saying that she couldn't write that, she can, but it was a different time back then. It's the 1970s. Like, I would assume that without the internet, even you wouldn't know how to write about diverse people. And that's the thing, Donna Tartt is critiquing so many other things. She's critiquing the classism of wealth, she's talking about the elitism of higher education, the dogmatic propaganda of Julian. Essentially, what she's talking about here is basically what she as a white woman could only grasp at her experience or at her economic background. She can't be writing about person of color or their struggles within the higher state of education because she is not a person of color. So the entire argument about Rebecca's making, or what I infer about it being not diverse enough, is literally, it doesn't make sense, because Donna Tartt is critiquing from her own perspective or from her own lived experience, and she can only do that from the lens of a white person. She can't do that from a lens of a person of color. And she's not talking about the secret history in this glorifying way of, look at all this whiteness. No, she's critiquing, like, essentially Richard in the story is a marginalized person. He's literally poor, and homeboy has been lying through his teeth the whole time in the story, telling people that he's rich when essentially he's not. And it's ironic that his name is Richard. And because he knows essentially the moment the others learn that he's not rich, they will treat him differently, because he has already seen how they treat Bunny, who, although his family was rich once, are now entirely bankrupt. They see the kind of attitude they give him, that they think of Bunny as lesser than them. And if they in any point find out that he is poor, that he essentially has no money, he's literally working from paycheck, not even paycheck to paycheck, he's literally just poor, they would just stop interacting with him, period. Because these are people who only interact with rich people. They have no concern to be mingling or interacting with people below their wealth bracket. That's what Donna Tartt is critiquing about the classism that happens at higher educational institute, and also the classism that comes into it. You cannot take into context about how they cannot be people of color here, because that would be something that's ridiculous to expect of her, because she's a white woman who wrote this book primarily in the 80s. That's the thing, I don't really know what kind of thematic response is Rebecca talking about here, because Babel largely talks about colonialism and the evils of higher educations or whatever that goes on in that story, and it's nowhere at all sort of overlaps with the secret history, rather than they both being dark academia. I don't even know if I can consider Babel to be dark academia, because if anything, it's more historical fantasy rather than dark academia, because like I mentioned, dark academia is this pursuit of an education or a subject matter to a lens of obsession, where the character takes what he has learned to a dark descent. They do it with horrible intent rather than the goodness of what the subject matter or the education can provide. Like, quite properly, in the secret history, the students are all learning the Greek, the Plato and everything, and they become so obsessed with the idea of living like Greek and Roman people that they essentially do not care enough to ascertain the time that they live in and the morality that comes into play, that has to be taken into consideration to the times that they live in, that even murdering people, they doesn't even seem to face them, and they perform a bacchanalia and then they murder people and they don't even think much about it. And this really brings into the account that the obsession they have with the Greek and Roman studies is not that they're trying to understand the philosophy and the idea behind what was said back then, or even how people lived back then, or what they can ascertain or take with them in the time that they live now. No, they just literally want to be like the Greek and Roman, and they literally think of themselves as a Greek and Roman, as people from this time, of a more civilized time, and they see themselves as in a position of a higher species rather than everyone else. And because they're so isolated from the rest of the school, that they cannot ascertain that, they are actually weird people, that they think themselves as, someone who has greater worth or value compared to other normal people. And that's not even considering the wealth that they come from. They just think that, they study the classics, they are essentially the greatest people to ever live, and that anyone who does not study classics is quite essentially stupid and beneath them. And that's what this obsession with the idea of the classics has wrapped their mind to such an extreme extent that they cannot tell right from wrong anymore. All they can think is in this Greek terms and Roman imagery, that they view themselves in this way rather than see that's not a time that we live in, that they essentially just forget what it means to be human. That's what dark academia is. And if you want to take it in a more literal term, like I mentioned about Frankenstein, is that Victor becomes so obsessed with the idea of resurrecting a corpse from his study of medicine that he essentially wants to play God. His idea of studying medicine is not to help people or to heal people or to save life. He literally just wants to create life out of corpses, and that goes against everything that medicine is about, that he takes it to as such an extreme extent of what the academia that he has gained from. But Babel talks about colonialism and silver magic and linguistics, and I don't know how does that inform me of how it's supposed to be about dark academia. Okay, maybe you can say either Robin or one of his friends, maybe they take it to an extreme end. Maybe the idea of linguistic in itself, opens up a new sort of power for them, and they think that they can exploit this power to take down the British Empire. Or maybe they think, this power will finally allow them to gain the power that they never had, because they take it to the very extreme end, to this dark descent. And maybe then I would consider it to be a dark academia, but that's not what happens here. They're just using silver to make magic, and at nowhere at this point does the academia in it actually pushes them past the boundaries of morality. It does not make them do the unassumable. It does not make them do horrible things or things that they never assumed that they will do. They aren't pursuing academia to the depths of its corruption, of its abhorrent, of what education can mean in a sense when you take it to a dark place. That's not what's happening here. It's just talking about silver magic and like colonialism, and that's it. That's not dark academia. That's just historical speculative fiction. And it's like, that's why I say it just because it gives a vibe of academia, they're like, it's dark academia, which is not. It really is not. And like, I am so tired of people just making this up. It's so funny that it's the irony that the whole point of the secret history is critiquing the horrors of aestheticizing vibes rather than saying truth for what it is. And what happens here is people are just aestheticizing the vibes of dark academia than actually knowing what dark academia means. And like, the irony, it just writes itself. The article also points it out that Babel, on the other hand, is concerned with toppling social hierarchies, and so the question becomes how much our protagonist Robin is willing to give up individually to serve a higher purpose. So essentially what Babel is talking about the greater good, about how colonialism is bad, how we have to topple the British Empire, how we have to rebel against them because they're exploiting other people. But that's all there is. So I'm failing to see how this is supposed to be a thematic response to the secret history, because the secret history, it's very quintessential thematic bits about classism, elitism, and Donald wrote this book as a parody of a Greek tragedy, and that's what people fail to get. They just think this is a cozy little commercial book about a murder mystery, which is, it's not even a murder mystery. Like, we literally find out that Bunny gets killed in like the very first page, and that's what's like wonderful part of this book, book is that we learn the murder from the very first page. We just come to understand why it happens and how it happens, and then the consequences of the murder in itself. And it literally is written like a Greek tragedy, because when you read any of the Greek tragedy, that's how it all starts. You literally get the context to everything that happens, and then you get into the scenes of the actors playing out the part. The chorus, gives more context into whatever's happening, and you have the actors coming in to play their part, play out the scenes and everything, but you still get the context of the general idea of what's happening. It's not like watching a movie where you're following the narrative in a linear sequence. A play gives you extra context to stuff that is happening. You have the stage directions, you have the chorus tells you what has happened and what is happening, so that you don't just go into the play without knowing any context to what is happening. And that's how The Secret History is written, making a parody of a Greek tragedy. She's just writing it in a novel form. I don't think anyone ever realized it, or maybe they have and nobody's ever talked about it, and I realized it on my sixth reread. So that's why I'm saying it's like I fail to see how Babel is supposed to be a thematic response. Is she just critiquing that there's no people of color at higher education? Is that it? Because if that's it, did Rebecca even read what The Secret History is about? Did she even take the time to internalize and understand its theme? Or did she just read it at one go and thought, this is too wide, I can do better? Because that's what I feel Rebecca's books are, essentially, or the books that she's written after the Poppy War trilogy, is that maybe she reads something and she thinks I can do better, and then she goes out to write them and they're all so mid. And I also have a problem with her books because of it, and in spite of it, that she does not take the time to actually internalize and understand why she's writing what she's writing, or what is an idea that she wants to bring out to her readers, or what are the themes that she wants to discuss. No, she just wants to write to prove to people, and probably herself, that she can do better. Because that's what Babel feels like. Babel just feels like she read Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell, and she read The Secret History and thought, I can do better, and then she wrote Babel. And because why else would you call it a thematic response and a tonal retort to this beloved book? Both authors took nearly a decade to write. I mean, if Rebecca had put 10 years of work into writing this book and then called it a thematic response and tonal retort to Doctor Strange, Mr. Norrell, and The Secret History, then sure, I would say, okay, she did put in the work to write this book, but she didn't. And so I can only assume she's doing it as a sort of, to prove that she can, or that she can do better. And I'm not just saying this, I have evidence of this, because we have Yellowface, and Yellowface is the testament to what Rebecca thinks writing is supposed to be, and what she feels that she has to do with writing. Not that she's writing because she has this innate desire to explore an idea, or that she's consumed by this idea to write this story. Nothing like that. It's just to prove that she can do it better. It just feels like she's parroting things, not that she actually has something essential to tell people. And this is prevalent. Yellowface came out, and my god, the publishing industry lost their minds trying to label it as the greatest literary novel. It's the satire of the century. People were losing their minds reading it, and when I read it, it just felt as if Rebecca had no idea what to write, because I think at that point Susanna Clarke hadn't released Piranesi yet. So Rebecca's I don't know what to write, I don't know what else I can do better. And then she probably opened her notes app where she wrote down all her grievances about reading Goodreads reviews of her books, and people critiquing her about how her books are mid, and people saying she's not really an established author, she cannot really be a real author because she's not a white person or something. I don't know what actually went on, but she probably journaled or ranted in her notepad ad or something about so much of her grievances, and then she found them again, and she's it feels a bit wasteful to actually just delete all them, so I'm going to just compile them into a book and send it to my editor. Because Yellowface does not read like a satire. Yellowface just reads Rebecca wrote angry comments in her iPad note app and then just turned it into a story, because it doesn't even make sense as a satire, and I'll explain it in another video I do about Yellowface, I guess. But that's what I always felt. It's perfect point of a satire, I can tell, is the movie Parasite by Bong Joon-ho. And that's also another critique that I have. People always say oh, they love Bong Joon-ho, they've watched all this movie, and they all just list out his English movies like Okja, Snowpiercer, and Mickey 17, the latest. And nobody ever references his Korean movies. I mean, people, do better. Watch his Korean movies, you fucking cowards. They are the greatest movie that's ever made. Watch Memory Memories of the Murders. Like, I didn't even know Bong Joon-ho actually directed that movie until I watched Parasite, and I saw, oh my god, he directed The Memories of Murders too. It's like one of the greatest films ever made and one of my favorite films of all time. And Parasite is the pinnacle of what a satire is, because satire is supposed to be this exaggeration of this absurdity, but it's also talking about social commentaries that comes hand in hand with the absurdity. That's what satire is, because it's bringing up this very important point of social commentaries, but also making it in this really absurd, ridiculous way to put out this message. Yellowface doesn't read like that. Yellowface just feels like a hot dumpster fire. Like, you just cannot look away from it. That's what it is. It's like a train wreck that had happened and that it's on fire and you just can't look away. I think it took a year or less than that for her to even publish Yellowface, and you can actually see it from the way she wrote it. And then Susanna Clarke comes up with Paranosy and she's like, I can do better, and that's where we end up with Catabasis. And I'm still waiting on that book and to come out before I do my video. And from the few reviews that I've actually watched online from people who got the arc of the book, and if I'm right about where the story is going, we're gonna have a at least 5-hour video to get through, because there's so much to unpack, there's so much to talk about. I already wrote down so much I want to discuss about that book when it comes up, because I think by far that's quite possibly her worst book ever. Okay, coming back to this article. Okay, this part of the article is quite funny. Quote, we see the two protagonists of these stories make starkly different, almost opposite decisions, yet they are not as different as one might expect when considering their final choices. Both Richard and Robin, despite being protagonists, are pulled along for much of the story. They are not charismatic leaders or boundary pushers, they just want to survive by blending into their environment. They both fall for the allure of the institutions they find themselves in, caught up in the esteem it will give them because they've never felt particularly important as individuals. They are even both willing to cut away parts of their identity to further integrate, as we see Richard forsake his lower class upbringing and Robin trade his Chinese birth name for something more English. Okay, this part is actually quite inaccurate, because Richard in no way forsakes his lower class upbringing. Like, Homeboy's whole attitude towards his past is that he just wants to forget he ever came from a place called Plano. He just wants to completely erase his past. He wants to present himself as this rich people to blend into the environment. We do not see him like forsake his... What does he mean, forsake his lower upbringing? Can you actually forsake your lower class upbringing? Like, what kind of... What is that? There's no such thing as you can forsake your lower class upbringing. At no point in the story does he ever forsake. Because there's nothing to forsake. Homeboy is just lying through his teeth to appear rich so that he doesn't get, the lower class treatment by the rich people. Like, socio-economical background and cultural heritage are two very different things. Like, yes, you can forsake one to assimilate yourself better, but you cannot forsake your socio-economic background, because how does one forsake their socio-economic background? I mean, like, unless you're rich, then you forsake your wealth, then I guess sure, that makes a point. But when you come from nothing, what is that to forsake? There's nothing to forsake, because there is nothing there with you in the first place. So I don't understand what this last part about Richard forsaking his lower class background means. Like, if anything, it's appropriate for him to forsake his lower class background to assimilate to the rich people. I would assume that's more reasonable thing to do compared to Robin, who forsakes his Chinese cultural heritage to assimilate to white people. What part of like Richard's socioeconomic background is there to forsake? Because Homeboy comes from nothing, like quite literally. He comes to Hamden College with exactly zero money. He's on financial aid the whole time. So the whole point of the story is he's lying to everyone about it. So there's nothing for him to forsake, because he literally comes from nothing. So it's not even a word. Like, what the hell, man? It's so ridiculous. Like, oh my god. See, this is why people should read. Okay, so this other part talks about code. We see gender and sexuality play a prominent role in the secret history. The Hamden College friend group is made out of 4 men and 1 woman, all of whom are white. But there is a marked difference in the way each of them interact with Camilla compared to each other. Camilla finds herself the object of each of their affections at different points and is forced to turn down their romantic advances multiple times. Another member of Hamden group is gay, but we see Francis downplay his sexuality and make almost joking passes at other men to be on the right side of the homophobic taunts about him being predatory. However, the survival strategy adapted by Richard in response to his poverty, Camilla in response to her womanhood, and Francis in response to his queerness is denial. They all underplay their marginalized identity to get as close as a cis straight white rich man as they can. This creates a culture contrary to our Oxford cohort where they challenge each other to take pride in their various identities. We even see them teach each other, as Vic and Letty do with Rami with regards to women's rights. All three characters of color consistently try to educate Letty, a white woman, on matters of race and colonization, and even though the lessons never stick, the fact that each of them continue to speak up changes their cohort's culture. Okay, first of all, I don't know what book this person read, but at nowhere in the story does Francis actively deny that he is gay. He just doesn't acknowledge it. That doesn't mean he is actively denying it. That's two very, very different scenarios. Like, when Richard finds out that he's gay, he doesn't go about like denying it. It's like, oh no, I'm straight all the time. Like, no, the moment Francis meets Richard, he's already like, what are you into? Do you like the girls? Do you like the guys? Do you like anyone in between? Like, he's already assessing his sexuality. So the fact that when Richard does find out that, Francis is gay, Francis doesn't deny it at all. He's like, yeah, sure. Do you want to get on with me? Like, Francis is always looking for an opportunity to have a good time. That's the whole point of who he is. Like, at no point is there ever denial, and that's very different to someone who actively denies something about their sexuality, which means that there is something to hide. Francis doesn't hide it, he just doesn't acknowledge it, so that people will come up with their own perception that, oh, he's not gay. It's not that he's actively trying to portray this image that he is not gay. He is not. People who see him for who he really is, they know he's gay, and as long as they don't acknowledge it, he doesn't acknowledge it either. And that's also the thing, that he doesn't owe anyone an explanation for his sexuality. And also, this was written in the 70s, and like, was the far higher chance of people not coming out. I mean, also, that's the whole point of, you do not owe anyone an explanation or a coming out for anyone at all. Like, if you're queer and you do not want to sort of come out to say you're queer, and that's fine. Like, there's also this whole point about how people are always, they want you to explicitly talk about your queerness. They're always like, you have to come out, you have to state who you are. Like, that doesn't work for everyone, and some people just doesn't want to acknowledge it. Some people just doesn't feel the need to acknowledge it, as long as they know who they are, and that's fine. And that's also what plays into this idea that Francis doesn't acknowledge that he's gay. It's not that he's in denial. Even when his grandfather finds out that he is gay, he doesn't say, oh, I'm gonna run away with some guy and live together forever and be happy. No, like, these are rich white kids. Their primary, I would say, motive throughout the entire book is self-preservation. We see that when they kill the farmer. We see that again when they kill Bunny. And we see that again when Francis marries this white woman called Priscilla to still be kept in the inheritance of his family money. The only reason he ever marries that woman is because he doesn't want to lose money. Also, these people don't know how to live like normal people. They're so used to living like the rich people. The idea of even living like a normal person without money is almost unimaginable to them. Like, I mean, Francis does go on to try to kill himself later on, but he doesn't go through with it because he knows he cannot live with a woman, but he also cannot live without money. So that's the dichotomy. That's the whole point of Donata trying to make, how these white rich people essentially cannot live without money either, and that informs us about their own idea of classism and how that shapes them to who they are. And the point I'm trying to make here is, Francis at no point in the story does he ever deny he's gay. He doesn't acknowledge it. That's about it. You can say, Richard fantasizes the fuck out of Camilla any opportunity he gets. Like, if Hamden College and the classics group is viewed through a rose-tinted glasses, Camilla is put on the highest pedestal a rose-colored tint glass can ever give. Like, he just has this strange picturesque idea of, and that's the thing, he doesn't even view Camilla as a person. He views Camilla as an idea that he would love to have in his hand. Like, he aestheticizes her the way he aestheticizes everything else in his life. Like, he thinks about Camilla being this wonderful girl, this beautiful girl who's smart, who's intelligent, who looks angelic, who's like, he literally just sees what he wants to see rather than actually get to know Camilla as a person. And so in regards to everyone else compared to the boys, we don't really know who Camilla is because Richard does not tell us who she really is. We never really know who she is. And I like to rebuke about how Camilla underplays or denies her womanhood, which is not true because throughout the novel, it is only Bunny that sort of undermines her capabilities and an intellectual because of her gender. He's the one who's always, critiquing her because Bunny is essentially the worst student in the classics class compared to Camilla. And he underplays her intellectual because of her gender. He talks about her as if she is somehow lesser than him on the account of her gender. I mean, he did try to sleep with her, but, Camilla did reject him, and so that sort of spurred him into, Camilla is not really a real girl compared to his girlfriend Marion, who's like the typical American woman who is like the quintessential woman. So there's a point he makes in the book where he talks about how Camilla does not have a mother's touch, and then Richard's like, you do know their parents died when they were young, right? It's like, yeah, and that's why she turned out the way that she did. If anything, it's only Bunny that underplays her. Everyone else sort of does not view Camilla through the lens of a gender, except for Richard, because he has this idea of her rather than actually know who she is as a person. But other than that, nobody actually criticizes her or downplays her or actually belittles her in regards to her gender. It's only just Bunny. So I don't know what this article is talking about, how Camilla is underplaying her womanhood or in denial to appeal to straight white people, because she doesn't need to, because for one, we later learn that she has been sleeping with Henry, and Henry is like the straightest white man you can ever get in the story. So she doesn't really have a problem with that. And two, she's rich, so she's not going to be at the mercy of another man or his money. And that's the funny thing, because Camilla, I think, is supposed to be a sort of a stand-in actually for Donna Tartt, because when Donna Tartt was in her college, actually Hamden is actually based on Donna Tartt's old college called Bennington. So I always felt, and some people have also commented that it felt that, Camilla is supposed to essentially be kind of a stand-in for Donna Tartt herself, because she was the only woman in her classics class as well. That's also one reason why Richard doesn't actually ever get to know her as a person, that he just views Camilla through his idea of who she is. And the thing about Camilla as a woman, she doesn't perform, or that she doesn't see her as a typical white straight woman. If anything, Camilla is actually going against the femininity performance that what you associate with a straight white woman is supposed to be. Richard constantly talks about how she dresses very similar to her brother, that they almost look like a pair of Flemish angels. Richard tells us that she's very beautiful. He goes to great extent to explain how she's beautiful in her own way, that she's not the kind of typical girl that you would see as beautiful, who's more frivolous in her appearance. If anything, Camilla goes against her gender norm essentially, because not only is she pursuing classics, which ordinarily it has always been exclusive for white men, but she also does not perform the kind of femininity that you expect someone of her gender to be, compared to someone like Bunny's girlfriend Marion. Marion is said to be like the typical white woman. Like Richard kind of explains how she looks both young and like a mother, and then he says it makes sense because she's studying early child development, that she deals with children, and that's what you typically expect people of her gender to do, that you do something that is essential to your gender, and one of it is taking care of children. And Marion goes into studying a program dealing with children. So that's also one of the critiques that Bunny makes against Camilla, how she's unlike Marion, who has a mother's firm touch essentially. And so I rebut this statement how Camilla is, in response to her womanhood, is in denial, which is not. If anything, she's going against her gender norm in being in the spaces that is mostly just occupied by white men. Like, her studying classics in itself is no way underplaying her gender. If anything, it's insinuating that despite her gender, she's able to study it. I mean, that's also because she comes from wealth. That's also the point, that she's not just relegated to someone that you typically find people of her gender studying, sort of like Marion, who studies early childhood program or development or something, sort of like Judy Puvi, she's into fashion. You know, all these sort of stereotypical ideas you have about the female gender and what is associated with it. Like, if anything, Camilla transcends all that. That also comes into play about how much we can take Richard's words for it, because we're all taking this from his perspective. So it's not like we know the objective truth, it's all subjective because we're all taking it from his perspective. So whatever he tells us about Camilla, we can only take it at face value. But even at face value, we can already see she goes against every stereotype that is circled around her gender. She studies classics, which are predominantly occupied by white men. She does not dress mostly in feminine clothes or anything. She dresses very similar to her brother Charles, and Charles is a guy, so you know, she has this sort of tomboyish look, but Richard still sees her as this beautiful angel that he's ever seen. And if anything, she's more than intellectually capable as any of the boys in the class, and she is able to reject all of their advances, primarily Richard and Bunny, when they do quote-unquote want to sleep with her, and she just rejects them, and that she has the capability to do that. If a guy had written a secret history, you know, the moment Richard had asked out Camilla, she would have been like all too happy to just be with him. You know, that's how men frame the narrative. Like, any attention a guy gives a girl makes her day any time of the day. Like, that's the essentiality. And the fact that Camilla actually rejects Richard and Bunny, keep in mind that Richard, throughout the book, we get the idea that everyone wants to get into his pants. Like Judy, Francis, like, homeboy is good looking, he just doesn't realize it. And even then, Camilla rejects him. She's like, no way. And we see that for all intent and purpose, she's in love with Henry. And even then, it's not that she subjects herself to the stereotypical role of being a girlfriend for him. They hide their relationship first and foremost, so we don't really know that until the very end. But even then, she does not think, you know, it's my relationship with Henry, why do I have the need to tell any of you anything about this? So everything that we are shown in the story about Camilla goes against her gender norm. So there's no point in the story, in any point, does she ever downplay her femininity. She does not tries to be less feminine to be in the spaces with the guys. She does not dress more like a guy to fit in with the rest of them. No, that's just naturally who she is, and how she presents herself, how she sees that, you know, she's as intellectually capable, if not more, than the boys. And Julian expects that. I mean, Julian is also after her money, but like, you know, Julian still accepts her. If Julian was more than any elitism and he thought that, you know, classics is only a space for a guy, he would have completely rejected Camilla in the first place. He would have only taken Charles in. So if anything, Camilla is a perfect example of how she is not the stereotypical girl in the story. And this is a book that came out in the 70s. Like, if we had the story now, she would have been a strong, independent, badass woman in the story. Like, she can do everything in this story despite what it is. But this is a book that came out in 1997. So for what the story is talking about and telling us of her and the role she plays with her gender, you know, it's does goes against the gender norms in its entirety. So I don't know what this article is talking about, how Richard downplays his poverty, Francis downplays his sexuality, and Camilla downplays his femininity. Like, nowhere in the story does any of this character downplay anything. If anything, they just know how to hide it better. But that is not because they're trying to deny anything about it. Richard literally has to like assimilate himself to the rich people. He's no way downplaying his poverty. He's just lying through his teeth. Francis doesn't downplay his sexuality. He just doesn't acknowledge it. Doesn't mean he's out there denying the whole story that he's not gay. Camilla is not downplaying her womanhood or femininity. If anything, she is the perfect embodiment of her femininity, and that she is not stereotyped into this typical gender norm that we associate with femininity or female gender. Yeah, another like ridiculous part about Babel is how only Robin, Remy, and Letty, who are the people of color, and the majority of them at Oxford are white people. There is no other people of color in there for them to actually sort of form a group or form a community with, for them to feel they have to take pride in it, because this is a predominantly white space. This is a predominantly white higher educational institution. You're not going to go in there and be like, oh, I'm so proud to be another people. No, you're going to do all you can to assimilate yourself into that white culture, into that white spaces. You want to be accepted. Nobody's going to go in there and like, I am going to be the black sheep of this space, that's not how society works. That's not how people function as people. Unless you're an Aquarius, then sure, I guess that's a different matter entirely. But I don't think any of them are like, are you saying all 4 of them are Aquarius? But that's not logically possible. But regardless of that, like, the point I'm trying to make here, that it seems ridiculous that, all 4 of them from various different cultures, and they're the primary voices to which we read the lens of Babel. Like, you're telling me all of them are just like in white spaces and they're just announcing to the whole world like, I am proud to be this and this, and I'm like, I take pride in my culture, without even the least bit consideration that they're in a predominantly white space, and it could essentially endanger them to make such statements. And this is during a time where colonialism was a big thing, and they're essentially working in the higher education to push forward the power of the empire, to grow the empire. You're telling me they're doing this in this space. That's the thing. I can understand if they did come across, or they did sort of encounter a rebellious group or people rebelling against the empire, or they do understand the cruelty of what the empire is doing, or there has to be some sort of catalyst, there has to be some sort of turning point that makes them realize that as much as they try to assimilate into the white space, they will never be accepted on the account of their race, of the color of their skin, that they can never fully be part of the English people. And that's the thing, telling me these people are flaunting their identities and their race in the 1930s. Like, I can suspend my disbelief for a lot of things, but this is already stretching it to a point of like ridiculousness. The thing is, I don't have a problem about these characters trying to educate one another about their race or their culture or women's rights or whatever rights they're talking about here. But the way they're doing it, it feels like they're talking from the 21st century. It's the same thing with the problem that I had with like A Study in Drowning, how the feminism is so in your face that it's not subtle at all. It's the same thing here. It's that you are writing a novel that is set in the 1930s. You could do a bit of nuances of these characters struggling to accept where they come from and where they are going, how they're going to preserve themselves, preserve their culture, what they're trying to do to survive, or, in regards to their gender and race. Like, you can do it in a very nuanced way that also feels authentic to the time. Like, you don't see people in the 1930s going about and, soapboxing the way we do today about race and gender and women's rights. You don't see that. You see people in quieter moments, trying to educate, trying to teach, trying to correct people in small ways, in small manners. It's a conversation, and that's the thing, these people talk about it as if it's this one big soapboxing that they all do, instead of actually, this is a conversation they supposed to have. She could have done this in a very nuanced way. Like, you don't see Donna Tartt writing in A Secret History how Richard goes around soapboxing about how, the rich people shouldn't look down on the wealthy, or the rich shouldn't, preserve their classism, or that the institution itself is a big classist place anyway. And you don't see him soapboxing out of the way. We see him internalize all this thing, and we get the nuances of what is happening. Like, in nowhere in the novel of The Secret History as the word classism or elitism ever brought up, but we all still get the messages regardless, because of the most important thing of the author golden rule is that it is show, don't tell. But Rebecca, throughout the novel, not just this novel, like all her other novels, she just tells all of these things without actually showing us the nuanced capabilities of these characters. This problem about how characters from Babel talk like they're from the 21st century rather than someone from the 1930s. And like, even people from 10 years back, from in the early 2010s, even people back then didn't talk like this. And that was only 10 years from where we are today, and people didn't talk like this. And you expect me to suspend my disbelief that people in the 1930s go about soapboxing about their race and gender and women's rights in this predominantly white space? Like come on. Okay, so here is what is coming down to. The final paragraph. Is it the final? Yes, the final paragraph. Quote, I'm not advocating for the embracing of one of these novels at the expense of the other, but if Kwang's goal in writing Babel was to open up the world of the secret history to everyone who was originally excluded and to respond to its shortcomings, she certainly succeeded. Babel, like the secret history, is thought-provoking, but it focuses on the moral question we will face today, rather than abstract philosophies that rarely impact us outside a liberal arts classroom. I think Babel's greatest strength is that its protagonist, Robin, is not unlike his predecessor, Richard, which only shows us that Richard was capable of making a different decision all along. Okay, the fact that this article states that Babel opens up the world of secret history to everyone who was originally excluded. Like, what does she mean originally excluded? Like, I never read the secret history thinking, oh my god, I wish a person of color was in that book. Like, I was reading it through Richard's, and that's the primary way you're supposed to read this book. And just talking about it makes me so annoyed, is that nowhere have I ever read a book in thinking, oh, this character should have been a person of color, or this character should have been a woman, or this character should be this, or this guy. No, I'm reading it as the author intends me to read the story. I'm not sitting there to think, oh, I wish I could see myself in it. Like, never once have I read a book and thought, I wish I could see myself in it. If I could see myself in it, yeah, sure, that's great. But essentially, I'm reading what the author wants me to read, which is not to see myself in it, is to read the story what the author intends me to read. And we essentially see the story through Richard's lens, and that's the whole point of the story, that we're supposed to view it from Richard's lens, and we can't trust him because he's an unreliable narrator, and not just because he does not see the story for what it is. Homeboy just lies through his teeth and refuses to see the truth. That's what makes him an unreliable narrator, and that's why we have to view this story through him, because we cannot view it from anyone else within the group of friends, because then we are going to be impartial towards them. Richard is the outsider that comes into the group, and then the group breaks, so he's the only one we can get this point of view from. I'm not sitting there reading the secret history thinking, man, I just wish someone of color could have been in this story, or that I wish I could have viewed Richard through a colored person lens. Like, nowhere am I sitting there thinking this to myself. I'm just reading the story as it is, and how Donna Tartt expects me to read it. It's already what I critiqued about how the diversity in the secret history is really just ridiculous in its all sense, because that's not what Donna Tartt is writing and not what we're supposed to take from it. She is critiquing the elitism and the classism within the Hampden College in regards to the whiteness that it is, because regardless about Richard being white, he's still poor and he still has to lie to be with his friends, because if he ever reveals his financial background, they, regardless if he's white or not, they're still gonna disregard him because he's poor. I mean, yeah, sure, he gets away with it because he's a white man, but that is still a bane of existence for him, that he's not rich, that it is still a point of contingency, that he cannot be where these other characters like Henry, Camilla, Charles and Francis, and even Bunny to some extent is, because the wealth gap is far between him and the others. So, like, I don't know what this article is supposed to say, that, it opens up the world of everyone who's supposed to be originally excluded. It's bloody ridiculous. And that's the thing, the fact that, the article says, Babel, like the secret history, is thought-provoking, but it focuses on the moral question we will face today rather than the abstract philosophies that rarely impact us outside a liberal arts classroom. Like, this is the kind of thing that has led us to the world that we live in today, that is just completely filled with AI, that people think that, what you learn outside of abstract philosophies is not going to impact us outside of a liberal arts classroom. And that's why we live in a world now where tech bros think that, you should just not fund any arts at all. We all should just, dive into STEM. Essentially, we should just all enslave ourselves to capitalism and just live our life as slaves. That's the kind of thing people in the capitalist society today think of, because what is the arts going to do in the real world? It's not going to contribute to anything. Kind of nonsense that people who are so stuck on STEM subjects being like the ultimate thing you have to learn, business, law, whatever it is, like they're the only things worth studying, because otherwise what's the point of liberal arts? Has no place in the world. And yet we see people revere celebrities who are musicians, who are in movies, who are poets, who are writers, and then they'll be like, liberal arts has no impact on the real world. Like, this is the kind of ridiculous argument that just gets on my nerves. And that is also sort of the point that Donna Tartt is making in the book, that the fact that when you learn classics, you're supposed to internalize and incentivize its teaching, its learning. You're supposed to understand the theory in practice and apply it outside once you go out into the real world, because the real world is filled with so much moral conundrums and complicated situation, and life is one big philosophical question. So if you do not take the time to understand what it is, you will not understand the subtlety of what it means to make important choices, what it means to make important decisions, what that means for your life, who you are, how does that inform you about the beliefs that you have, the person it shapes you up to be. Like, that's the thing. People think, arts, literature, classics, these are all bloody useless things. They're not going to work in the real world, because that's not going to help you get a job, that's not going to help put money in the table. And they think it's such a thinking that is so narrow-minded and closed off, that you think the only way to live life is to make money, because that's essentially the world we live in. Actually, we can't live like that, but unfortunately that's the world we live in today, and we have to make money to live. But that's not the only point of living. How has humanity survived all these years? Why do we tell stories? Why do we admire paintings? Why do we hear music? Like, if those are not important things, those are just useless things in the world, then why do we have that? Why do we incentivize all of this? Why do we place great value to poets, to writers, to musicians, to painters? Like, why do we place such importance on these people who have achieved such on near immortal recognition, and yet still tell us these are useless? Because we as humans have always been meant to create. We've always were made for creation. Even in all of our creation, even in theology, even in literature, even in stories, there's something in us that also is a reflection of us. Even God in some image, we painted him as an image of us. And what does God do? God creates. And what do? We create stuff too. And didn't we create God as well? It's a sort of metatextual interpretation if you want to go into that route. But essentially, that's what it means to be human. It means to understand what it means to be human, and what other way can you learn what it means to be human other than understanding liberal arts? Why are some people so inclined to paint, to make music, to sing? Why is their intrinsic motivation is just for the love of the game? Why do they feel the need for that? Why do they feel that despite not making any money, despite nothing coming out of it, they still have this incredible love for this creation? They just want to do it because there's this intrinsic need for them to do it, because that's who we are at the core of our parts. We are these people who create. And coming back to the point about this article talking about, what Donna Tartt is writing about the secret history is how when you take classics out of context, when you wrap ridiculous thoughts and you take it to a point of no return, that's when you are going to go down a dark descent. The problem of the secret history is not about these characters learning about classics. It's about these characters using the classics to rationalize their own absurdities. They are using the philosophies that they learn, and they are taking it out of context, and they are purporting different meanings to what essentially the classics are teaching us, the philosophies. They do not internalize this learning to say, how do we integrate this into the life that we go on, to the future that we live, to the society that we become a part of later on in their life. No, they are so closed off and isolated from the rest of the university, from the rest of the student population. They're basically living in a bubble. And that's what Donna Tartt is also critiquing here, is that because they're all isolated in this one classroom with Julian, they do not have any other perspective to compare to. All they have is Julian's word, and Julian is basically propagating them to his dogma. He's just molding them into his image. He is manipulating them into to thinking what he wants them to think. Instead of think about the kind of philosophies they have, you debate about it, you think about it, you ruminate on it. Like, that's the whole point of understanding classics, about the philosophies that it brings out. You see the difference between how civilization was back then and who we are today. You learn to differentiate the two facts, and that's also why that Nietzsche's quote is in the beginning, that a young man cannot know what the Greeks and Roman are, and he does not know whether he's suited to find out or not. And if you're not from that time, you cannot certainly understand what it is like to be like them at that time. So Julian essentially gets his way with the students, that they have no one else to look for, no other perspective to understand or read. All they have is these Greek poets and philosophers, and the only one who can interpret those is Julian, and he purports his own meaning to them rather than actually having them to learn what it really means, or have them go out into the world to learn what it means. He basically just dogmatizes them in his view, and that's what really pushes them to this other extreme of, this dogmatic view of what it means to be a Greek and Roman person. And they have no one else to tell them that, this is not how you're supposed to be. So they take everything at face value without even a shred of doubt. And that's really what leads them to the end that essentially befalls them. So that's what Donatart is critiquing. It's also the class looking at Julian through this rose-tinted glasses, because he is the sort of only authoritative figure that they have, that they listen to, because they do not have any doubts of why they should disbelieve whatever he's teaching them. Like, he's the adult here, he's the authoritative figure. They naturally will listen to him and assume that everything he's saying right, especially Henry, who in his word, he says, how can I make the dean of the university understand that there's divinity among us? Like, he basically views Julian sort of like a god figure. How do you tell this sort of people that there is not just one way to think like this? There is no just one person whose words you have to take in its entirety. That's not how living in society works. That's not how you live and grow and think as a person. You have to be around other people. You have to learn from others' perspective. You have to empathize. You have to learn to see beyond yourself. That's what the classics is supposed to teach you, to look outside of yourself, to look beyond yourself, to see a world that in a time that you've never lived, you've never known, to see what is essentially has civilization come to and what they have created, and to see and understand and take that in and see how you can put to use to your future. That's what it means to study classics. Is nowhere in whatever these people are doing, and yet you have people reading the book and thinking, oh my god, studying classic means I can perform a bacchanalia. That's not what is happening here. That is not what Donatart is trying to say here. And this is such a specific lesson that you cannot take anything in isolation, and especially you cannot put anyone upon a pedestal or look them through the rose-tinted glasses. You have to have critical thinking. You have to look for the objective truth. You have to see people for what they are rather than being biased on your own perception of them. And yet we still have people talking about, oh my god, Henry is like the hottest one in the secret history. You've got people like that, even though it's clearly stated in the book he's a bloody sociopath, and yet you have people who aestheticize him for his immaculateness. And the kind of irony here, like, it just writes itself. And the fact that, not only is this book a parody of Greek tragedy, it's also become a parody of the genre that it's given birth to in itself. So it's amazing, actually. Like, quite literally, he is the person who manipulates them into performing the bacchanalia, because if he had not brought it up in class, if he had not sort of insinuated for them to perform and see what happens, those kids would not have performed the bacchanalia. But because they take everything Julian says at face value, they think, oh, he is asking us to perform this bacchanalia, instead of more appropriately asking, why is he insinuating us to perform this bacchanalia? If you have read what a bacchanalia was or used to be during the festivals, like, you would know this, like, strange stuff happens there, and this guy is basically asking us to do that. And like, also, they don't question it. They just like, oh, okay, we should try it out, not think like this is something weird for this professor to ask us to do or insinuate that we should do. that's the point, and that's where the dark academia comes in, is because they really wrapped ideas of what it's supposed to be rather than what it is actually supposed to teach them, what they're supposed to learn. But then they take in the wrong messages, they take in the wrong lessons here. They're not supposed to be performing bacchanalias, and yet they are doing that, and they don't even do it properly, and they end up murdering people. And what do? They end up murdering another person to cover up their murder. These are not things you're supposed to take away from in the classic lesson. And the whole story also comes back to another quote that Donald has in the beginning, is from Plato. And Plato says, "Come then, and let us pass the leisure hour in storytelling, and our story shall be the education of our heroes." And that's essentially what the whole story is about. It's the education. Richard is telling us a story of his education, his time in the classics group, his education about the classics, and not just that education, his education in trying to finally learn to see the fucking truth after what happens. And that's what this is. It's an education both to him and to us about the horrors of when you aestheticize things rather than see them for what they really are. Jonathan is writing about all of these things, and nowhere do I see this, even any of these themes even being thematically responded in Babel. The only critique that Rebecca has is like, oh, it's not diverse enough. I'm like, because Donald is a white woman in the 70s, like, I can't expect her to write about a black person, can I? So it's like, what else are you talking about? What else thematic response are you talking about here? And it's like, that's what I fail to see. Wow, I did not realize this video has already been as long as it is. But yeah, so those are my thoughts on essentially Babel's thematic response, or mostly just rebunking whatever this article has been talking about, the secret history. And like, that's the thing, most of people who read the secret history, that's their surface level understanding. Donata took 10 years to write the book. There is so much in there that unless you can still read it for a fun read. Essentially, when I first read it, I too thought it was a wonderful book. I just read it in like a week, finished it. I was like obsessed with it. And like, it isn't until I actually got intimate with the playwright's Greek philosophy, with understanding Nietzsche and everything, do I start to really get the little references that she puts just beneath the surface, so that on your second, third read, when you do read it, you do find these little tidbits in that you start to see the thread that she's connecting one point to another. You start to see the deeper level of what she's talking about, what Donata is trying to tell in the story, how she's referencing to this older Greek plays about the intertextuality. And there's also one more part in the book. This is the second time Richard has gone to see Julian, and he invites him down there, and he is talking. And so Richard asks Julian, because this is after Julian had said, he has to drop his other classes with his professor, and he has to be only exclusively be taught by Julian himself. And Richard is a bit alarmed, but homeboy doesn't see the glaring red flag right there. And then he asks Julian, like, so what do you do in there? And he says something in the lines of, we do not study here. They do the most glorious kind of play. And that's the fun part about the word play here, is that you can take that he's meaning it that they have fun in that classroom, that they do not take things seriously, that they're more proactive. It's not just the usual seminar lecture where the professor is just yapping in the front and you're just droning on and on about whatever the class is, that it's a more like intimate setting, that more proactive, that they're challenging each other in classes. It's a more playful kind of conversation that's going on, is what one of its meaning. But in another idea is that in the glorious kind of play, it's actually a reference to the Greek plays, the Greek tragedies, that he's saying that this whole thing to me is a kind of play, that I am the elusive mystical professor who is educating his young students, young heroes, about their education. Like, he believes himself like this whole thing is a production of a play, that he's playing a part. That's really where the Plato's quote comes in. Let us pass a leisure hour in storytelling, and our story shall be the education of our heroes. Essentially what Julian is saying here, it is a glorious kind of play that we do here. It's not just a playful manner in which they study, but it's also a play in which I am directing and I am showing you the way you should view this world, which is not the right way you should. And Richard actually comes to realize this at the end. They have to do this kind of survey to rate their professors, and Richard is, ticking his boxes, and then he sees that Henry has never once in his life taken any class outside of Julian, and then that it finally alarms Richard enough. He finally thinks that, one person shouldn't just be excluded to just one teacher, because then they do become dogmatic in their views of this one person. They do not have any other perspective to look at or understand. That's the first time he becomes alarmed. Henry almost feels it's abhorrent to even rate Julian to give a survey about his teaching methods or anything. And he says this quote, "How can I make the dean of our college understand there is divinity among our presence?" And it's a funny thing, people have this theories that he's actually, referencing that, Julian actually is a kind of a Dionysian character, in that, the whole point of him pushing the others to perform this bacchanalia is because he wants them to do that, because he's a Dionysian figure himself, that he's elusive and he's mysterious, that you don't really know him, but then he has this group of students that, basically hero worships, and it's a bit like how the Maniacs sort of worship Dionysus. So, but also like it's this idea that, how Henry's kind of does hero worship Julian, to think that, Julian is everything to him. Julian is like nearly like a god in his presence. So you can see the kind of plays she has with his words, the kind of double meaning in the terms that she uses. It all comes back to the Greek plays and the Greek tragedies, and how The Secret History essentially is a parody of a Greek play. It's just Donna Tartt wrote it in a novel form. So yeah, those are my thoughts on kind of like the thematic response on The Sacred History, because I still fail to see how Babel is a thematic response. But thank you for actually making up to this end. Like, I don't know, sometimes I yap a lot and it just ends up being a couple of hours long and I have to go and edit stuff. But this was just a spontaneous kind of thing that I just made up. So yeah, thank you for listening, and see you when I get my next video out.